the obelisk. The obelisk is the key.
Greetings and salutations, and welcome back to the Obelisk. Today's show is a pre-recorded episode that we did back in September 13th, with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. He's a psychiatrist out of New York who's been very vocal about various medical countermeasures that have gone down over the last 3 years. And we had the opportunity to talk to him for about an hour, and he's a really nice guy. We really appreciate his time and his insight, and I hope you all enjoy the interview. Take care. Thanks for agreeing to the interview and coming. It's, like I said, it's an honor to talk about now, if not 3 years. I don't remember when I first found you. And then when you started getting together with Dr. Cowan, that was amazing, because I've been following him for a while too. So thank you for all your work there.
Oh, you're welcome. He just came to visit this weekend.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, we don't live too far from each other.
I thought he was in California for some reason.
He moved to the Hudson Valley of New York, near Albany.
Excellent.
Like in the beginning of the pandemic.
So that's where all his chickens are, and goats. And...
Yeah, that's where his homestead is. That's right.
It's great. Cool. So, an interesting thing I found was that your background was you're a psychiatrist, and you were very vocal at the beginning of the pandemic, just about everything that was going on. And what tipped you off that this was not right, and what part of your psychiatric training led you to believe this? I mean, did you... I saw pretty quickly that it seemed to be a psychological operation to some degree, and I wondered if you saw that too, and how that played into your whole dissection of what went on.
Yeah, well, I think my psychiatric background was actually kind of critical. In fact, when I look back over all the different careers I had, because I've had several different careers leading up to forensic psychiatry, which I really no longer practice, but it was the forensic aspect. So forensic psychiatry is a subspecialty of psychiatry, and there are several of them, like child and adolescent psychiatry is another subspecialty. And this involves the interface with the mental health system and legal and administrative processes, such as court proceedings, criminal and civil penalties, fitness for duty, and those types of evaluations. But the principle of forensic psychiatry, and in forensic psychiatry and in psychiatry in general, there's no hard science. So in other words, everything is subjective. There's no blood test that you can check and say someone has depression or schizophrenia. They are all based on an objective opinion. So there's a standard of evidence that is fairly low and definitely way below the scientific method. And what the convention was in my profession was that you had your opinion with reasonable medical certainty. And in order to achieve that, you had to be very thorough. So you would review lots of records. In an important case or a bigger case, like, for example, a murder trial, which I participated in one of those and testified in the trial, there were records that were from the jail, there were employment records, there were school records, there were mental health records from childhood, there were interviews with family members and friends, and then there was the evaluation of the individual who I was making an opinion about. So this amounted to thousands of pages, and much of it was completely irrelevant, but nevertheless you had to go through it and find any relevant facts or details that could speak to the opinion you were trying to answer. And it's a very rigorous, and one of the skills that you develop is pattern recognition, where you see patterns of behavior, and then that leads you to ask more detailed and nuanced questions that can get closer to the truth. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, because one time I was interviewing someone who seemed to have very significant psychotic symptoms at work, like they were hearing voices or seeing visions. But it took 2.5 hours of interviewing and rapport building with that individual before they were comfortable enough to fully disclose what they were experiencing. And it was exactly that. In another situation, there was a public servant who had made accusations of sexual assault from a fellow public servant. And I interviewed her for 9 hours over 2 days in order to get all of the details, because the material was so sensitive emotionally that it took a lot of hand-holding and kind of going around, beating around the bush to get to the heart of the issue. So this was really a rigorous and in-depth exercise, and a way of fact-finding and making opinions. So when a number of things happened leading up to this psychological operation, as I believe you correctly refer to it, was that in December of 2019, I came across some work from Alpha Vedic, another podcast with Bear Lando and Mike Winner, where they were discussing a book about Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp. And I think it is the Ethel Hume is the author. And this is the first time I heard about Béchamp, and the first time I heard about the theory of pleomorphism, which fits under the terrain umbrella that I know we'll probably discuss a little bit later. And this opened me up to the possibility that things in germ theory may not be fully true. And that correlated with some other material that I heard from Dr. Jennifer Daniels, and she was one of the individuals, and she's a doctor who used to practice in Syracuse, where I was based at the time, so there was an interesting geographic connection with her. And she talked about how several illnesses that are said to be caused by viruses didn't have the evidence of such, like that Koch's postulates were not proven, and such as things like hepatitis C. And I had also heard Dr. Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize winner, and I had interestingly looked into his work because he has a lecture about climate change, debunking some of that science, and he's a Nobel Prize winner, of course, so that is quite a hefty qualification. And he's not the only Nobel laureate who criticizes climate change, by the way.
Even Patrick Moore is
yes, absolutely. But Kary Mullis also had this lecture about that he couldn't find evidence of the existence of HIV. So I was kind of primed with these stories that when I was traveling to California from the East Coast in February of 2020, I saw people wearing masks at the airport, which I'd never seen before. And this was long before any lockdowns or mandates occurred. And it made me very, very curious. So I found out about the videos with, people collapsing in the street in Wuhan, China, and heard that story. And then I started looking into it because in the news stories it said that there was a novel virus. So I decided to just go right to the primary evidence and let me find the scientific paper where they discovered this virus. And at that time, of course, I really had no knowledge of how virologists discovered viruses. I made some assumptions about it, that you would find them in nature, that they were very, very tiny, and you'd need to see them with an electron microscope. And of course, I had seen images in medical school that were called viruses, as well as computer graphic artist renderings of viruses. But I really didn't know what the procedure was. And when I began reading the papers, I quickly understood that they made all sorts of assumptions. Like, for example, before even beginning the experiment, they already were convinced that they were going to find a new virus. even though all they had were some people with atypical pneumonia in a hospital. And atypical pneumonia it's called atypical, but it's common. It's seen every year, and it basically is a situation where there's no clear diagnosis for the doctor. In other words, they might do a bacterial culture and it comes up negative, and they might do some PCR type tests for common viruses, and those would be negative, so they would just call it atypical pneumonia. But it's quite common, and sometimes it's might even be referred to as community acquired pneumonia, and that's what these people had. But there was this assumption, and then upon further reading, some things really stuck out at me, that there was a very, very tiny number of patients that they were looking at, like less than 10. And I thought, if there really is something significant like this, there should be hundreds of people to take samples from. And then I saw that the experiment that they did was very strange, because there was no independent variable. And having published my own original research, I know that there are two critical things that you need for every study in order for it to really be scientific or to conform to the scientific method. One of those is you need an independent variable, and that's the thing that you're testing. So for example, if you wanted to do an experiment, does salt increase the boiling point of water? You would need to add salt and only salt to the water in your experiment, because that is the independent variable you're testing. Is salt causing something? Right. And in this experiment, they never separated out the virus from the biological fluids and other potential viruses or other compounds or even microorganisms that might be in the sample. And they also did something which I would call a simulation, where they simulated the growth of the virus in essentially a test tube or a culture flask with a foreign genetically modified cell line, or in one case with lung cancer cells. And I'm thinking, these genetically modified cells, they don't grow normally and they don't represent human tissue. So this is a very strange experiment, but there was no independent variable, so they never separated the virus and only showed it or tested it for anything. And then the other requirement for a scientific experiment is a control study, where you include everything except the independent variable. So for example, you would take the water, and in the experiment you would add salt to the water, and then you would measure the temperature at which it starts boiling when you apply heat to it. In the control experiment, you would put nothing in the water, or you might put something besides salt, like you might put sugar in the water and see if that makes a difference. And you might do both those experiments, actually, because you want to know for sure that the salt, the thing you're testing, is actually what produced the effect of changing the boiling point. So in this experiment, you'd want to have a sample that had everything else in the sample that the virus had, but except the virus. And that would be a control experiment, so that you'd know that doing this cell culture in the laboratory itself doesn't produce the results that you say are only due to the presence of a virus. So at first I was like, how could these studies even get published without being scientific? And it was perplexing. And then I had this realization that the particles that they were showing in the images that they were calling viruses, and by the way, there's no way that they could say that these particles were an actual virus, because they didn't measure any of their properties other than their appearance. And we know that there's this whole other field of research in extracellular vesicles, or sometimes these are referred to as exosomes, and that is a word that most people are now familiar with, I think, because of what I talked about, is that you cannot differentiate these exosomes, which are natural breakdown products of our own cells when they're damaged and dying, from what they point at as viral particles. And later on, I found out that they actually published several papers where they stated this outright, that they can't differentiate viral particles from cellular breakdown products, without doing some other kind of confirmatory test that assesses the property of the particles, that they would be able to do what they say viruses do. And so once I determined that there was no factual or scientific evidence that there was any virus causing any new disease, and of course also there was no evidence of a new disease because there were no unique symptoms or unique pathological findings. Now over time that there was a lot of ways that it was propagandized, and things were made up like long COVID so that you could take people with other health conditions and say that they had COVID, and that's what made it unique in some way, right? But that was all done much later after the fact. So once I was armed with this information, I looked at what else was going around, and I saw that one of the old tricks of the trade was being used to generate fear, and that is computer modeling. Mm-hmm. And I've come across this before. Actually, I helped set up a computer modeling department at a biotech company for the purpose of drug design. And they sent me to like a 3-day course to learn how to use this very complicated software that was doing lots of computational modeling, taking into account all sorts of atomic and chemical theories, like to do energy calculations and various types of hydrogen bonding and all this complicated stuff. And you were supposed to be able to put in a crystal image of a molecule and then see how your other molecules that you make up from scratch would interact with it, and then that would guide your ability to do drug design. But what I noticed is that you had to make a lot of assumptions and put in values that you didn't know what they were in reality. And that depending on how you set these assumptions or starting conditions, it could really make a huge difference in your results. So you could call this a fudge factor. Mm-hmm. And if you were unscrupulous, now we were trying to develop drugs that actually worked, right? So, and that's what would make us money. So our incentive at that company was to use it as accurately as possible. Because if we did it wrong and then spent all the time and money to actually make the chemicals to test them in real life, it would be a huge loss if we came up empty. So, but for others, I could see that if you had certain motivations, it would be very, very easy to manipulate the outcomes in order to make them fit a theory or fit some kind of political agenda. Mm-hmm. And later on, I saw that this is exactly what they had done in the field of climate science. Yep. Using computer models. And if you can go back and verify that these models were wrong in every situation because they made predictions about the future, and this was years ago, so you can look at what really happened and see how wrong they are. But there was a academic shill named Neil Ferguson in the UK who basically fudged a computer model to generate fear, saying that this new illness was going to kill millions and millions and millions. And that fear was the impetus to generate lockdown policies and mandatory masking, and even ultimately to encourage uptake of the experimental injections. Mm-hmm. So putting all this together, you could pretty clearly see that this was a psychological operation where they invented the appearance of a health problem. And through fear and the nocebo effect, and then through very destructive policies, not just for the general public, but in medical protocols, they ended up killing quite a number of people. Mm-hmm. And making it appear as if they died from a disease when in fact they were just simply killed by a number of different mechanisms that varied regionally and by institution.
Yeah, like a 40 cycle count PCR test, right?
Well, that wouldn't kill anybody, but that would label you.
Right.
Yeah, well, clearly any test where you're testing for something that doesn't exist, it can't be accurate. So every result that you get is 100% false, whether it's positive or negative. But I also then found out about Event 201 mm-hmm. and the SPARS event exercise, exactly, and also the document from the Rockefeller Institute from 2010, Lockstep. So you could see clear evidence of how this was very precisely planned out in advance. And they even used a lot of the same buzzwords from those planning events, directly in there. So all of this put together, you can clearly see how this was the biggest, perhaps, PSYOP ever conducted on a global scale.
Yeah, it's it's crazy what we've been through. And do you remember before? I guess it was like the summer of 2019 when there was this mysterious vaping illness, and pneumonia that people were getting. Did you ever look into that?
I remember hearing that there were a lot of emergency room presentations of people with acute lung injuries of some sort that was associated with vaping, but I didn't look into it too particularly. But I did see the whole pattern that emerged with the vaping industry, because at first, the first time I ever saw a vape was in the VA clinic when I was in my training as a psychiatrist. And I walk in there one day and there's a guy right in the waiting room just vaping up like crazy. And I'm like, what is that? They had no rules or regulations about it at that time. And, many veterans were like chain smokers. So It was kind of like heaven for a while until they made rules about it. But what you had at the beginning was a lot of small companies were getting into this market. They were using pretty straightforward materials like the same kind of liquid that is used for asthma inhalers, and putting nicotine and some flavorings in there. And not, all kinds of fruit and candy flavors at first. It was like, different tobaccos and mint and things like that. Right. And you could see that some people were using this as a safer way of smoking, and some people were using it to quit, and it was gaining popularity. But at some point, the big tobacco companies started buying up and consolidating all these small companies and kind of taking over the market. And as that occurred, they changed the formulations and began adding addictive and harmful chemicals, just like they've done to tobacco in the cigarette industry. And I believe that the health problems were a result of that process, and maybe the companies were putting things in there that they didn't realize were going to be quite as harmful as they were, and there were some health consequences as a result.
Yeah, it was interesting that there was a global pneumonia, whatever, COVID thing after that. It was almost like I don't know. I don't know if they're related. I just found it interesting that they were so close.
The thing is, if you really look at the numbers, and they're so fudged with statistical models, it's hard to distinguish. You really have to look at the totals. There were no, in order to give the appearance that there was a new type of pneumonia or respiratory illness, they had to take people out of other categories. Right. So, we saw like almost no cases of the flu.
Exactly.
Or we also even saw reductions in heart disease and respiratory disease that were relabeled as COVID. Right. So, but the total number of people with respiratory illness was not any different. Right. It was just all the way that it was labeled and presented and rebranded. Exactly. Yeah. So there's no reason to believe globally that there was any respiratory toxin that was disseminated, although that may have taken place in certain locales in order to bring about the appearance of a scary illness, like perhaps there's a lot of things that happen in northern Italy. Yep. And there's a gentleman who did excellent research about that, Michael Bryant. You can find his blog and see his article on that.
Are you familiar with John Cullen at all?
No, I can't say that I am.
Okay. He's done a lot of interesting work about how his opinion is that COVID was a cover-up for some other type of pathogen that was released.
Well, the thing is, there's simply no evidence of that.
He has some evidence.
Well, he may have evidence that some laboratory was working on something, but I don't think he has any evidence that of the actual pathogen out in the wild.
No.
And that's really the only evidence that would tell you if that happened or not. But I can, further elaborate that if you examine all of the science that claims that any kind of germ, whether it be bacteria, yeast, fungus, or virus, causes any illness, you'll find that there actually is no evidence of that whatsoever. All of the scientific experiments that were done in that respect have disproved it. There are unscientific experiments that are put forth to claim these things, but once you read them, you'll see that they're quite ridiculous, and you cannot draw any conclusions from them. So if there were going to be some kind of man-made germ that causes illness, it would not resemble anything in nature. It would have to be a completely novel invention. And I think that's highly unlikely, because if you think about it, the only way to go about doing that would be some kind of micro machine, like some kind of robots that could go around and inject poison. But if you're talking about something that would cause one human to pass an illness to another, there's simply no model of that in nature. It's been substantially tested in scientific experiments, and they've never been able to pass an illness from one human to another in an experiment.
Was
May
that the
I
work?
ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm curious about the relationship with, say, electronic signals. So like the activation of pathogenic manipulation of biosensors or sensors that affect the innate immune system. Is there a causality here? Is there a dynamic relationship between the two? So this, of course, invalidates germ theory further, but I'm not sure where you stand on that.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Are you asking if some sort of electromagnetic exposure could cause something specific, or?
Well, that certainly is a dynamic to this and a factor to consider. But yeah, say some sort of electronic signal that could, in fact, cause something that looks like or acts like something attributed to what is considered a germ pathogen. So,
but I've already said that there's been no increase in the respiratory illness, so there's no reason to find an additional explanation.
Okay, so there's no electronic component here. That's all I wanted to get at.
Wait, an electronic component of what? If there's no illness to explain, then why would you need an explanation?
Well, I'm talking about I'm talking about illnesses in general. So say, take a hemorrhagic fever. Is there a component here that an electronic signal could activate something like that?
I'll tell you that there's definitely no evidence of that specific thing. There is one study that I found, because I want to say that there's a lot of claims made about what 5G or other EMF may cause, but there's very, very little research of toxicology on this technology. And in fact, the companies, the communications companies, have not even fully disclosed exactly what the technology is, like what frequency it's operating at, what amplitude, etc.
Nor have they done any studies on the harm caused by it, if any.
Right. Well, we saw the director of the FCC, saying that they're not going to do it specifically. Right. They don't want to stand in the way of progress. So what I've only found is one study that's an actual clinical study, and it's used in laboratory animals. And this was done in Russia during the Cold War, but later on it was made public through a Freedom of Information Act request from the CIA. So the CIA had actually obtained this research through their espionage activities, kept it hidden, and then disclosed it later on after so many years after the Cold War was over. And in this experiment, they did use a specific frequency that's commonly associated with 5G, but we don't know if 5G really is at this frequency. And the animals in the experiment, when they were exposed to a significant dose and proximity of this radiation, they did develop health problems. But the health problems were really their whole body. And what they said was that it disrupted the oxygen flow from the blood to the mitochondria and resulting in a multi-organ failure. And the kidneys seemed to be the most susceptible and had the most significant degree of organ failure. But there was also failure in the bone marrow and depleted cell counts in the blood. So this is a little bit similar to ionizing radiation exposure almost in some of those characteristics. So if there were some kind of untoward exposure, I would more expect to see those types of symptoms with multi-organ failure, low blood counts, and the blood oxygen level would not be diminished because the oxygen got into the blood fine, it just couldn't get into the cells or into the mitochondria, according to that research. So if people had their pulse ox values were low, it would not be consistent with that type of an injury. Now, that being said, what the actual 5G is could be a different technology and may have different effects that we don't know. One other thing we do know about this kind of radiation is that it has been used for crowd control in warfare. And when it's used this way, it causes a burning sensation in the skin that makes people retreat because it's too painful to advance. And as you get closer to the source, it gets more intense. So this is another thing if we saw that. Now, we do know from people who are exposed to various types of radiation and dirty electricity, like smart meters, if they're living in very close proximity to a cell tower, or if they have strong Wi-Fi routers in their house, they can get some mild problems. But those usually are things like ringing in the ear, nosebleeds, migraine headaches, visual problems or eye fatigue, sleep pattern disruptions. Those are the most common types of experience people with too much exposure from those devices, in my experience and research.
Thank you.
Great. That's all awesome. So did you say that was Michael Bryant?
Yes, with the research about Italy.
Yes.
Yeah, very meticulously done.
I want to check that out. All right, cool. So yeah, what you were talking about dovetails real nicely into the whole terrain theory versus germ theory, as far as pathogens not being proven to cause disease. Was that Béchamp who was doing that? I don't remember who it was. It was like having someone with the flu cough into the mouth of another person. Was that him or someone else that I'm thinking of?
Yeah, no, that was Rosenau.
Okay.
I believe it's Milton Rosenau. Those were the contagion studies from the Spanish flu,
right?
Where none of the people got sick. Béchamp was a microbiologist, and he did experiments with microorganisms and fermentation primarily, and he was a contemporary of Louis Pasteur.
Okay.
And Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard was really kind of on Béchamp's side, and Louis Pasteur has been exposed now as mostly a self-promoting fraudster rather than a real scientist. And Béchamp did experiments with fermentation, and fermentation was considered an experimental model of infection by some. So fermentation is, how you make beer and wine, and how you make vinegar, where you give a sugar source, usually a plant sugar of some kind, to microorganisms, and they metabolize it and make some product, either acetic acid, which is vinegar, or ethanol, which is for alcoholic beverages, or they can make other things as well. They can also convert sugar, making grape sugar. And that's one of the types of fermentations actually Béchamp studied. And so since you have kind of microorganisms that are living on some kind of biological material, that's how this could be somewhat of a model for infection. And originally, Béchamp thought that the microorganism that performed the fermentation had to come from the air, and did a variety of experiments in flasks. And when he didn't expose the flask to the air, he didn't get the conversion of sugar. Now, later on, now Pasteur actually went with that and didn't follow Béchamp's subsequent work, because after that Béchamp determined that if he put the right minerals in the flask, that even if it were sealed from the air and couldn't get any microorganisms from the air, using sterile water, that he would still get the conversion of the sugar. And in other words, there must be microorganisms already in the plant material that has the sugar, or something else he added to the experiment, but it turns out it was that. And he then later on looked under a microscope and found that in biological or organic materials, as well as in mineral material like mineral chalk, that he found these tiny little particles, and he called them, I believe, microzyma, or tiny bodies, and that they could change shape and become different microorganisms like bacteria and yeast. And this is essentially the same as we're told about stem cells, right? That we are made from embryonic stem cells, which form, when the egg and sperm fuse, and during the growth, of the embryo, that there are these stem cells, and the stem cells become every different type of cell in our body. So these were like stem cells for microorganisms. And so this could say that if you had, for example, microorganisms growing inside your body, which we all do, in fact, probably 10 microorganism cells for every single human cell in our body, if the whole cell theory is correct, that they actually come from inside of us. They don't come from the outside.
Interesting.
And, we kind of knew this through some types of experiments or observations. Like, for example, if we have gangrene, right? Gangrene is what happens when a part of your body dies. Like, for example, let's say you get really severe frostbite and the tips of your fingers actually die. They're no longer alive. And, people might have seen images, they turn black. Well, now you have dead tissue that could be toxic and needs to be recycled, right? Nature never lets dead tissue stay around, right? It always recycles it, decomposes it. So the dead fingertips start to decompose, but they don't decompose by bacteria from the air landing on the surface and decomposing it from the outside in. They decompose from the inside out with bacteria that comes from your own tissue, and it undergoes anaerobic metabolism because there's no oxygen inside your dead finger tissue, and it eats it from the inside out, right? So we can easily observe this. We know that it couldn't come from the air or the outside because it's sealed off to the outside. And this leads to a whole different interpretation of what's going on when you have an increased number of bacteria at a site of disease in your body. That and the sort of theory of pleomorphism would dictate that these creatures evolve actually to clean up a mess, or to recycle. Their nature's recyclers. And this is just the same exact thing that happens in the compost pile in our backyard. That these organisms come out of the waste material that's put in the compost pile. They start eating it from the inside out, and they make waste products. And we know if we put animal parts like meat into the compost pile, it's going to smell pretty bad. And that's because some of the waste products of these microorganisms are pretty nasty stuff, right? We've seen this with rotting eggs, for example, where hydrogen sulfide is one of the waste products of the microorganisms that break down eggs. And we can smell this rotten egg sulfur smell from that. And that's what can happen in our body as well when we have damaged tissue, like if we have strep throat, for example. Now, we know that streptococcus is there in people without strep throat and people with strep throat. So it's not the cause. But when the throat tissue is damaged, it grows there because it will eat and recycle the dead and damaged cells from the lining of your throat. And its waste products will stimulate inflammation, which increases the essentially washing of that area by having us make secretions, mucus, snot. That's simply, the waste water from the washing machine. And we need that to flush things out, so the bacteria break it down, and then the waste products get flushed out of the body so that the tissue can repair and renew itself. And that's the everlasting cycle of nature.
And is that the process of, what is it, apoptosis, that whole
Well,
breakdown?
apoptosis or apoptosis is what's known as programmed cell death or senescence. And cells can die in different ways. They can, when they get older and outlive their function or their lifespan, and the different lifespan for different types of cells, they can undergo this self-destruct program, apoptosis. It's very neat done. The cell breaks down into smaller particles, which of course could resemble what they say viruses look like. They're called apoptotic bodies, generally speaking, and then the body can dispose of them properly, and then a new cell will take its place. But cells can also be destroyed by other forces, by mechanical stresses, like cuts and crushes, by chemical damage, and many other things, radiation, etc. And they can die in different ways, like they can undergo what's called necrosis, which is another type of, not as very neat and programmed, more of an ugly, destructive kind of cell death.
Caused by some bacteria now, allegedly.
Well,
like
that's the allegation.
Fasciitis, right?
Is there a relationship with like the mycoplasma here and all that within terrain theory?
Well, mycoplasma is just another form of bacteria. So it would fit in that pleomorphic cycle. And, what seems to be the case, and there's different ways of looking at this, that in different time scales and for different situations or different tissue types, the body tends to evolve different forms of bacteria, right? Like the throat is very commonly, it's the streptococcal forms, right? But the skin has the staphylococcal forms in skin infections, or, when they're basically cleaning up damage to the skin. So there is this kind of tropism and variability. When you have more chronic tissue damage, then eventually you get yeast and fungal forms. So those people that have, toenail fungus and candida and things like that, they have a much more chronic effect. And the bacteria that were sent previously were unsuccessful in resolving the issue. And so there's sort of different species and different healing programs that get enacted over time.
Cool. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was terrain theory in general. I'll let you describe it. I don't want to ruin it.
Well, that's okay. And it's terminology can be sometimes problematic in these arenas because terrain theory is not a proper scientific theory. It's really a paradigm of looking at health and biology. And there are several different theories under it. So the pleomorphic theory or theory of pleomorphism that I've just talking about is one of those theories under the terrain rubric. Okay. But essentially the underlying theme or ideas is that the quality of the terrain or the environment, the milieu, determines the health. So you could observe this readily if you are a gardener. Let's say that you want to plant an apple tree. Right now, that if you plant it in the right place, it could do well, and if you plant it in the wrong place, it might not even grow at all. Right? So it needs the right terrain. You can't plant it under a heavy canopy in the forest. You have to plant it where it's going to get good sunlight, right? And then it's going to need certain soil conditions, maybe a certain acidity of the soil, certain types of drainage, moisture conditions, all of these characteristics. And by the way, there's very thorough and interesting plant research on this. If you put that plant, or the plant is not in the right terrain, it's not going to thrive. Now, even further than that, if it's not thriving because it's not in the right terrain, nature will send various types of organisms to recycle it back to the ground so that another plant can grow in that terrain, which will be able to take advantage of it. So this research came from an entomologist who was employed by the pesticide industry, because we know that farmers who plant monocrops often have this cycle where their crops are unhealthy.
Yep.
And then at first, there are weeds and they use herbicides, and then there are insects and they use pesticides, and then there's fungus and they use fungicides, and there's that like sequence. And that's very similar to the sequence I was talking about in the human body, where you start with different bacteria and you end up with yeast and fungus. And fungus seems to be the final common pathway to recycle diseased organic material. So they assess the health of plants by something called the Brick score, which is a measure of how much photosynthesis. So how much is it eating and growing the plant, and if it's eating and growing a lot, it's a healthy plant, and if it's not eating and growing much, it's not healthy. And what they found is that certain pests will only eat plants that are damaged to a certain degree. So plants that are fully healthy, almost no insects will eat them. There are a couple that might eat them, but almost none of the pest insects will eat these plants that are fully healthy. Now, if the Brick score is a little bit lower, let's just, for argument's sake, say it goes down to 80% of the optimal. Well, then there will be a certain species of insect that will begin eating it. And then if it's even less healthy, it'll be a different species. So you'll have different pests depending on how poor the health of the plant is, but they don't cause the problem, right? They just come and eat it, and then we look at it and we say, oh, this is, this disease of this fungus or this black rot or this insect, aphids or whatever. Mm-hmm. But now we have the knowledge that they will only attack that plant and eat that plant if the plant is already unhealthy due to not being in the right terrain. And the same thing occurs within your body, according to this terrain paradigm, is that when the internal milieu or environment is disrupted by lack of resources, for example, so like malnutrition or dehydration, or from toxic waste. And that could be waste from your own body's metabolism, but most likely it is from man-made substances that we can't help but getting into our body because of our modern lifestyle and industrial exploits. And those things disrupt the terrain, just like physical trauma would also disrupt the terrain, right? By a cut, a broken bone, etc. And that imbalance and disruption is what brings about a state of poor health or disease, if you will.
Cool. That's really interesting. and that doesn't necessarily, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. That ties into the whole viruses have never been shown to cause disease type of thing too.
Well, it's not only that they haven't been shown to cause disease, they haven't actually been shown to exist.
Right.
So they do experiments where they say it causes a disease, but they're not actually using a virus in the experiment. They're using the fluid from a cell culture experiment, which they never actually demonstrated the virus to be a part of. Right. So it's a whole farce. And before I realized that these things were not the cause of disease, I did become awakened to natural healing. And this happened when a friend of mine suggested I read Kelly Brogan's book, A Mind of Your Own. And in it, she reported, having amazing results with people with psychiatric diagnoses. And in mainstream psychiatry, there's no amazing results. There's not even barely acceptable results. There's only crappy, poor results. And I saw how these drugs were not helping, and how they could even cause a variety of harm, like causing sudden death, for example. We thought that these vaccine injections were the first thing to cause massive sudden death, but antipsychotics have caused lots of sudden death in children and adolescents. There's a very large study out of Tennessee that people can look into if they want to investigate that further with all the Medicaid recipients there. So when I heard about this, I thought, I'm going to maybe have an opportunity to try this. And a former colleague of mine got in touch with me with some long-standing anxiety issues and was looking for a referral. And I said, hey, do you want to try this, diet and see if it makes a difference? And lo and behold, a month later, she was in remission. And over the next several months, we figured out that her problem was actually seemed to be caused by gluten-containing foods or, by bread. Yep. And I can't conclusively say it was the gluten because we didn't, she didn't take gluten pills by themselves, right? But clearly it was something, it was the food. It was this bread. When she went to Italy and had bread and pasta there, she had no problem. But when she challenged herself again in North America, she had a return of the anxiety. And so this was kind of my first real experience, witnessing this. But of course, once I saw this improvement, I'd never seen anyone achieve a remission from anxiety before in my career up to that point, and I'd never even heard about any cases of such a thing. It was something you just have to manage for the rest of your life, right? So when I saw this, I dove very deeply into study and into doing things, and I kind of over 2 years I observed this pattern. I'm like, all these stories where people are having miracles, like they're being cured from diseases we're told to have no cure, they're doing similar things. And I'm like, what is it? What's the common theme? And found out it was detoxing. And I had heard about detoxing. I thought, that's ridiculous. We're not poisoned back at the time. But now I'm seeing that, people are getting better from neurologic disease like MS, from autoimmune disease, from heart disease, all.
Well, you just muted. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Wait, is it me? Nish, can you hear him?
I can't hear him either.
Okay, it's not us. It's like your microphone switched inputs. Sorry.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
I hear you on both ears now.
My cord just came loose.
Oh no, you went out again, doctor.
Did he, or did he just trail off?
No, I didn't say anything. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, but you're really low.
Wow.
But it's okay. We're almost done.
What about now? Is that
perfect?
Any better?
Great.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's technical failure.
I think it's a Mercury retrograde right now. So
one of these things that I was curious about as you were just getting into this particular segment, and I know we're short on time here, have you looked into any of the studies with methylene blue and the cognition stuff? But also there seems to be evidence, and again, I don't know what that means anymore because there's so much chicanery going on, that anxiety and depression are affected by methylene blue.
Well, there's a problem studying anxiety and depression because, like I was saying at the beginning, there's no way to identify exactly what you're dealing with there. So it could be very, very challenging. I haven't specifically looked into methylene blue because my ethos is really about using only materials from nature. But I can tell you that there is some real research actually supporting natural healing. There aren't too many carefully, placebo-controlled trials or to that level, but there is a lot of evidence to support, for example, that toxicity is a major cause of disease, and that could be something that I'm really delving into now, where they look for industrial chemicals in bodily tissues. And what I'm seeing is that PCBs, dioxin, microplastics are found in nearly everyone's body, in nearly all the organs and tissues in your body. And we know these things are poisonous from a variety of other studies. So we have this kind of evidence. And then there are lots of animal studies and some human studies with things like cilantro tincture, which is something that I actually offer. And it's quite amazing, because what they did was they took laboratory animals and they exposed them to poisonous heavy metals like lead. And then half of the animals, they gave this cilantro tincture. And, you know, in this study, they used methanol, which causes blindness. So it was like they stacked the deck against themselves. But what happened was, not only did after they did this experiment, of course, they sacrificed the animals and then they examined their tissues. And what they found was that in the group given cilantro, that not only did the lead was gone, but actually the tissue damage was reversed. Whereas in the other group, they had lead and tissue damage. So, you know, this is really incredible that nature offers us compounds like this. And there are similar studies with zeolite, another product that I recommend. So even though there's not a, even small acceptance in the mainstream of this approach to health and healing, you can find studies that show tremendous promise. And
You dipped out again. No. The powers that be don't want us to talk.
Yeah, because we're getting into natural ways.
Of course, of course. There you go. You're back.
Okay. For some reason, the USB plug is just, nothing's moving here. I'm totally stationary, but it keeps slipping out.
Of course.
We're talking natural ways.
Yeah. So I think if we were able to do large randomized controlled clinical trials with some of these materials, there would be.
It slipped again. Whatever.
For the rest, that'd be better.
Just hold it in, and we'll wrap it up. And
I was holding it when it went out the last time.
Oh, really? Well, go ahead and finish your thought. We will let you go.
Well, I mean, my main experience is that when I worked with clients and taught them about detox protocols, they had amazing results. I mean, their health problems completely reversed in many such circumstances, and a wide variety of things, from cancer, even autoimmune disease seems to respond extremely well, heart disease, some developmental disorders, autism, multiple sclerosis, so many conditions. Right now I'm working with someone who's on the transplant list for a new liver, and we're trying to reverse the liver disease before that deadline of the transfer wait list, or the transplant wait list.
Oh, that's very cool.
So there's enormous potential here, and we've been held back by the allopathic system.
I have one question here. I had an autoimmune issue, big, and I went natural a long time ago, and it totally went into remission. But I'm wondering your thoughts on, and this will be my final question, the Gerson therapy, basically.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm a pretty big proponent of Gerson. I have one little quip with it that they took out the liver juice and changed it to liver pills and pretend to be on a vegetarian diet because the liver is a key nutritional component for success. But aside from that, Gerson clearly has a very excellent track record with many types of cancer and with many other serious illnesses. And it's something that anyone who asks me about cancer, I always bring this up as one of the first options that's out there. And also, Gerson therapy is what introduced me to the coffee enema. And I found the coffee enema to be extremely beneficial for general cleansing and specifically for the liver. And in my opinion, it's the best way to really help your liver heal. Yeah. So I would definitely, look into the Gerson Institute and Gerson therapy if you're having a health problem, and especially if you like juicing and enemas, because you'll be doing a lot of it.
It reversed my terminal situation 100%, and that's why I asked without front loading it. So, but I know there's a lot of people that do not like it and get all uppity about it.
Well, look, nature provides redundancy. So there's always other methods other approaches you can take. And I think it's good to have personal choice, because if you find something that really matches with your belief system, your worldview, and that would increase your motivation, that would actually increase your chance of success. So I always teach people about options, but that is one of the options that has the most evidence of a successful track record, and it's just why it's way up there on my list. But it's not the only path. So if you don't like it, that's okay. There's other options like water fasting, for example, which can be also just as successful.
Yeah. Yep.
Great. Well, this has been fascinating. I could talk to you for hours, but we have very little time. But thank you. Why don't you tell people where they can find you and anything new you've got coming out, or people should be aware of?
Yes, please find me on various video platforms like Odyssey, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as my website, andrewkaufmanmd.com. And I'm very excited because tomorrow is the opening launch of my new membership platform, the True Living Fellowship. And this is a place where, it's the next step once we realized that COVID was a scam and germ theory and medicine are corrupt. Where do we go next? How do we learn about the other corrupt institutions?
Oh, you died again. I'm sorry.
Oh, man.
There you go.
All right. So, how do we learn to live now that we have this new knowledge and embody the truth in our lives? So it's a community and many, many educational resources and media and webinars. So please look for that on my website, the True Living Fellowship, and check it out.
Great.
It's been a real pleasure, Dr. Kaufman.
Yes, very much so. I had one question about the fellowship and that whole organization you're setting up. Does that have anything to do with, or is Tom Cowan involved with his new biology? Is that all part of what you guys are building? Are you working together with that, or is it separate? Or
well, no, we're working separate but in parallel. Okay. And we have a pillar related to the new biology as well, because we're basically realized that what we're told about biology is not accurate. So we have to, but it's beyond biology because it involves physics and chemistry as well, geology, atmospheric science. So we are trying to be comprehensive, and we're also not just sticking with
science. You cut out again. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
It's got to be annoying. I'm sorry.
It is, but we're not going to be talking about just science. We're going to be covering law, family, education,
awesome,
nature, technology, spirituality. So really,
Ooh, sounds wonderful.
It
we
does.
want to cover every aspect of your daily life.
Great.
Holistic.
Holistic. All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and hope we could talk again sometime about whatever. Don't care. Just love talking to you. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaufman, and hope to see you again sometime, and appreciate your time.
All right. You're very welcome. It was a treat.
All right. Take care.